Part 1. The Coming of the Beast. Chapter 1. Dark. It's a picture of a skeleton soldier waiting outside the gate. It was noon and the sky was black. There had been darkness over the kingdom for half a century. For many, many years before, the people of the earth had not taken care of their home. They had burned down all the forests, reducing every last tree to ash. They had pumped the rivers, lakes and seas full of waste, killing all of the fish. They had dug deeper and deeper under the ground for oil until the planet was hollow to its core. Eventually, the earth took its revenge. The ice caps of the Arctic and the Antarctic melted. The floods were so mighty that whole countries became submerged underwater. Violent earthquakes shook entire cities to the ground. All that was left behind were piles and piles of rubble. Volcanoes erupted, pumping billions of tons of ash into the air. Without the sunlight, the crops withered and died. Nothing could grow. The kingdom was plunged into an eternal winter. It was the only world that Alfred knew. He was already 12 years old, but had never ever seen sunlight. Often he dreamed how it must have been to feel the sun on your face, or run through a field of tall grass, or swim in a sunlit sea. But it was just that, a dream. The boy had seen pictures of the sun in books and marvelled at it. A perfect circle of gold. Now the moon and stars had become invisible too. Alfred would spend hours and hours imagining how the sky must have looked with 1,000 little lights twinkling through the blackness. He was one of those children who liked nothing more than being alone with his imagination. In truth, he had little choice in the matter, having been sickly his whole life. Soon after he was born, he became ill. As a baby, Alfred had not expected to survive, but survive he did. Just. The child was as pale as snow and as thin as dust. He wore thick glasses to aid his poor eyesight. Often, Alfred was so weak he had to stay in bed all day. Thank goodness all around his bed were piles and piles and piles of books. Books, books, and more books. Books about animals, books about space, books about trees, books about dinosaurs, even books about books. There's Alfred with his big pile of books. Books about history were his absolute favourite. The trouble was that there was a strict curfew in the building where Alfred lived. Night was the most dangerous time. That was when there was most chance of an attack from the outside. Lights had to be out at 8 o'clock sharp. By order of the king, anyone caught with lights on would be severely punished. Punishments were brutal in the kingdom. Those in power had returned to medieval forms of torture like the thumbscrew, the Iron Maiden, the breaking wheel, and the pillory, the rack, the scold's bridle, the rat's dungeon, the head crusher, and the iron chair. Despite the strict rules, the boy loved his books so much that he would carry on reading by candlelight under his bed covers. The night our story begins, Alfred was doing just that. He was reading a weighty leather-bound book about the kings and queens of Britain through the ages. The first known one was Alfred the Great. He had become ruler an impossibly long time ago, in 871. Bearing in mind, at the time of reading you this, it's 2022. That's a long time ago. The boy was named after that first king. But it was hard to believe anybody would ever describe this Alfred as great. He felt anything but. As the boy was devouring the story of the beheading of King Charles I in 1649, a deafening sound rocked the room. Kaboom! Alfred dropped his book. Thud! And then he dropped his candle. He very nearly set the covers alight. Woof! Smothering the flames and blowing the candle out. Whoosh! He pulled off his bed covers. Whip! A huge explosion outside had illuminated the boy's bedroom with glowing red, orange and yellow light. Alfred slid out of bed and, using all his strength, limped over to his huge bay window. Just those few steps left him painfully out of breath. He leaned on the window frame to steady himself. Alfred's bedroom was high up on the top floor. From here he could see far across London. A building was ablaze, but not just any building. St. Paul's Cathedral. This historic structure, perhaps one of the most famous in the world, had been destroyed. Its huge white dome cracked as if it were nothing more than an egg. Huge plumes of black smoke billowed high in the air. Oh no, thought Alfred. No, not St. Paul's. He had seen many London landmarks destroyed over the years. Nelson's Column had been toppled to the ground. Crunch. The London Eye had plunged into the River Thames. Splash. The Royal Albert Hall roof had caved in after a bomb had blasted it to pieces. Boom. However, none of these were as sacred as St. Paul's. This was a new low. The cathedral had been built after the Great Fire of London in 1666. The glorious structure had miraculously survived the Blitz when Nazi bombs rained down on London during World War II, but now it was burning to the ground. Alfred's next thought was, revolutionaries. This had all the hallmarks of one of their attacks. The boy had never met anyone from this top-secret organisation, but the Lord Protector had taught him much about them. From what Alfred had been told, the revolutionaries hated the fact that power had returned to the king. They wanted to overthrow him and behead him, just like the Roundheads had done to Charles I during the Civil English War. These revolutionaries stood only for death and destruction. That is why the Lord Protector said they needed to be crushed at all costs. Rat-a-tat-tat! There was a burst of machine gun fire. No! The distant sounds of shouts. Ah! Was that a scream? Alfred shivered. As much as he wanted to look away, he couldn't. Every day there were attacks all over London, but explosions on this scale were rare. The boy pressed his hand up against the cold, thick glass and looked out at the devastation. This was the kingdom Alfred would one day inherit. I'll see you in the next video for Chapter 2, Lionheart. See you there.